Welcome to the Check-In, a podcast by the Telos Group on the Telos channel. The Check-In is a semi-regular conversation amongst the Telos team and guest experts where we explore the headlines from Israel-Palestine and across the world, wading into the complexity of seemingly intractable conflict to discover the power of peacemaking to heal us, our community, and our world. This is your host, David, checking in from Washington, D.C. today. Before we dive into our conversation, here's some important context to understand what's been happening between Israel and Iran the past few weeks, and why it's important for all of us to be following these developments. While Telos' main area of expertise isn't Iran, what's been happening now is directly connected to what is happening in Gaza and the West Bank. We have to see Israel-Palestine in the greater regional context to know how best to advocate for mutual flourishing, not just for Israelis and Palestinians, but for all people in the region. On April 1st, 2024, Israel bombed the Iranian consulate in Syria, killing 13 people, including several members of Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps, including Brigadier General Mohammad Reza Zahedi. In response, on April 13th, 2024, Iran launched hundreds of missiles and drones at Israel in an unprecedented direct attack. Around 99% of them were shot down in Israeli airspace by the US, UK, France, and Jordan, and Israel itself, although several people within Israel sustained minor injuries, and a 7-year-old girl from the Negev is in critical condition after being severely injured by missile fragments. Since then, the US has urged restraint on all sides and de-escalation. However, earlier today, on April 19th, there was an apparent Israeli drone attack in Iran on a major airbase near the central city of Isfahan. The U.S. confirmed that Israel directed the attack on the site, which also holds a nuclear energy site in the city. The International Atomic Energy Agency, the UN's nuclear watchdog, said there was no damage to Iran's nuclear sites, but is continuing to monitor the situation closely. Director General of the IAEA continues to call for extreme restraint from all parties due to the potentially devastating consequences of involving any kind of nuclear weapon or material in escalations. Now, over the past 7 months, we've been discussing the dangerous potential for escalation of what's happening in Gaza and the West Bank into a broader, more regional conflict. Today, we are at a potential crossroads. It is critical that we lean in and discuss and determine how best we as peacemakers can respond. To do that, we brought in Iran expert Joe Cirincione. Joe is the former director of Non Proliferation at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where he closely tracked Iran's nuclear program, and then, as the President of Ploughshares Fund, played a key role in the campaign for the Iran deal, which rolled back Iran's nuclear weapons development program. He will help us to explore why Israel and Iran are so at odds, how the recent strikes factor into Washington's relationship to what's happening in Gaza, and what it all means for us, those of us who care to see the human rights of all people honored in the region, and what we can do in this moment. Greg, thanks for joining us today. Where are you checking in from?
Just back from Columbia University, at home in New York City.
Well, there is a lot to discuss about what you just saw and heard, and maybe we will follow that up with another podcast very soon. We also have Joe. Joe, thanks for joining us today. Where are you checking in from?
My pleasure. I'm right outside Washington, D.C. in Tacoma Park, Maryland.
Well, we are having this conversation. Today is Friday, April 19th. Lots of news just came from the region last night. Joe was telling us earlier he received it on the way back from the airport. And there's so much to discuss about what this means for the future of the region, for the events currently happening on the ground in Israel and Palestine. And Joe has a lot to share with us, but we want to start before diving into the events of last night, what they mean, by zooming out a little bit, getting some context to put it all into color. And to do that, we're going to zoom in, particularly on Iran's relationship to Israel-Palestine. Why is this even happening right now? What is the relationship between this state and Israel and the issue around the Palestinians and their statehood? Can you just give us some context? Why does Iran care so much about what happens in Israel and Palestine?
Well, Iran sees Israel as one of its two main adversaries in the region, Saudi Arabia being the other. And for several decades now, there's been a shadow war going on between Israel and Iran. This is a war with actual casualties. So Iran, for example, has a nuclear program that it claims is for peaceful purposes to create fuel for its nuclear reactor, one of the few nuclear reactors in the region. The problem is, of course, those same centrifuges that can enrich uranium for fuel can also enrich them for a bomb. So Israel has long opposed this and has gone beyond diplomatic measures to try to stop the program into military measures, including the assassination of Iranian scientists and attacks on Iranian soil to try to disrupt some of those nuclear facilities. Iran, of course, sees this as a major problem and has tried to sort of push Israel back by arming, training, and politically supporting Israel's Palestinian and Lebanese adversaries. So Hezbollah to the north, Hamas, and the Palestinian Authority in Israel itself.
And one thing to note here, Israel does have nuclear weapons, correct? So you have this imbalance.
Israel has between 90 and 100 nuclear weapons. It's the only country in the Middle East that does.
Right. So Iran feels this perhaps sense of vulnerability without a nuclear weapon. It's this adversary in the region and is trying to perhaps destabilize in its intentions Israel's status in the region by supporting these other groups. Who are they? What is Iran's relationship to these groups? Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Depending on where you stand politically, the most benign interpretation of what Iran is doing is it wants to deter Israel from attacking it. And Israel has repeatedly called for regime change, overthrowing the current government. So there's grounds for that. You also might see some of the rhetoric of the Iranian government indicates that it wants to destroy Israel, that wipe it off the map. And so if you're an Israeli or an Israeli supporter, you might think that Iran represents an existential threat to you. So, where on the threat spectrum is the actual Iranian intentions? It sort of depends on your point of view. For the last 20 or 30 years, Iran seems to have wanted more or less the status quo. They are not seeking a war with Israel, but they seek to neuter, to deflect any attempts by Israel to destroy it. The groups that Israel mainly fears in its neighborhood are Hezbollah, which was created after during the 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon. Hezbollah is now the most formidable political force in the region, non-state force in the region, and that's based in southern Lebanon. Iran has played a major role since the 1980s in arming Hezbollah and helping it acquire, for example, about 150,000 rockets and missiles that could reach Israel. Since the election and the rise of Hamas in the Gaza Strip, Iran has helped arm and fund and politically protect Hamas. Iran also has relations with various resistance groups that operate in Iraq and Syria. Together, there's maybe 6 or 7 of these altogether, including Hamas and Hezbollah, that call themselves the Axis of Resistance. So it's all these groups that Israel sees as a threat and that Iran is using in order to, depending on your point of view, either deter Israel or work to eliminate Israel.
I want to get a little bit more into, just drill down for our listeners into sort of why Israel sees Iran as a strategic threat. And I think this is important because in the West, we're just always hearing like Iran is the big bad evil. And I'm not trying to say there aren't problems with Iran, but like we never understand why. Is it and get down to why. And then also on the flip side, like how does Iran perceive things? Because, we hear a lot about Iran's rhetoric around destroying Israel. Israel has long been calling for some sort of escalated conflict for decades now with Iran. So I want to understand that dynamic. Why are both parties so opposed to each other?
Let me give you my biases. First of all, I am pro-Israeli. I have family living in Israel. I'm not Jewish myself, but my family is, my wife is, my kids are, my grandkids are. I'm planning another trip to Israel. I hope I can still take it in May. I go at least once or twice a year. But I am anti-Netanyahu. I'm much more of a Labor Party, when there was a Labor Party, Peace Now guy, and so is my family there. And the reason is that I think that this right wing, particularly this right wing government in Israel, the most extreme government Israel's ever had, has advocated a solution to the Palestinian issue of basically eliminating the Palestinians, eliminating any basis for there being a Palestinian state. And in order to do that, the Netanyahu coalition, now including people like Ben Gvir and Smotrich, have tried to undermine both the Palestinian Authority, which is the governing body for the Palestinians in the West Bank, and Hamas. In fact, one of the criticisms currently of Netanyahu is that he encouraged some of the Arab states, particularly Qatar, to fund Hamas as a way of splitting the Palestinian cause. So there would be no one Palestinian group to negotiate with. So therefore, how can we have a two-state solution when there's nobody to negotiate with? So for all those reasons, Israel, especially the Netanyahu government, has seen its ability to crush and divide the Palestinians as requiring requiring it to cut off Iran's assistance to any of those groups. And there's a belief that if they could just eliminate Iran, overthrow the regime, the way the United States overthrew Saddam Hussein in the Iraq War, if you could overthrow that regime in Iran, you could weaken the Palestinians, and therefore Israel would have a free hand in clearing Palestinians out of the West Bank, cutting off Gaza, et cetera, et cetera. So that's why Iran, for them, is key to what they consider a final solution to the Palestinian problem.
I think it's a little bit more nuanced than that too, right? I mean, I want to push on that a little bit because, as we know, one with Hamas, which was born in the late 1980s, for example, Israel helped support Hamas as sort of a counterweight to Fatah early on. And up till October 6th, Netanyahu's official position was to support Hamas, because when you have the Palestinians divide and conquer, so like it seems like Iran is a little bit of this sort of, it's this shell game out there, distract, deflect. It serves this purpose.
Now that gets to the other position that Netanyahu's had. In order to alleviate U.S. pressure to compromise with the Palestinians, to move towards a two-state solution, Netanyahu is always focused on Iran. The problem for Israel, Netanyahu would say, is not the Palestinians, it's this external threat. It's Iran. He would much rather talk about the Iranian threat than about the Palestinian problem, than about the settlements, than about activities in the West Bank. In fact, that's what I see at play here. You have to ask yourself, in the midst of this Gaza war, which has been going on for 6 months, why does Netanyahu suddenly decide to hit Iranian territory? First, the consulate in Damascus. So on April 1st, Israel struck an Iranian consulate in Damascus, which under international law is considered Iranian territory. It's diplomatically protected. And in the process kill 3 leading Iranian Revolutionary Guard generals and a dozen other people. And these generals were responsible for aiding the axis of resistance groups in the region, including Hezbollah and Hamas. So why does he take that step? Because it shifts the focus away from what's happening in Gaza to what's happening with Iran. And all of April, we've seen the focus shift. And after the Iranian reprisal attack, sending 300 cruise missiles, drones, short-range ballistic missiles into Israeli territory, the Israelis were delighted by this. They welcomed this. In the Israeli press, you saw Israeli officials crowing that now they had won back diplomatic support from around the world. And that's true. Leading countries rose to Israel's defense. The U.S., in particular, helped shoot down many of those drones, many of those ballistic missiles. And the focus shifted away from Gaza. So, for example, right now, what are you and I talking about? We're talking about the Israeli-Iran conflict, not what Israel is doing to still block humanitarian assistance from getting into Gaza, how they're turning away trucks because they have green sleeping bags, and green is considered a military color. We're not talking about those kinds of outrages. We're not talking about what's happening to the Palestinians. We're talking about the threat of a greater regional war with Iran. That is perfect for Netanyahu. That's a big reason why for most of his career, remember, he's been the prime minister for 16 years in Israel, he has wanted to focus on Iran as a way of avoiding the conversation and U.S. pressure on Palestine.
So glad we're having this conversation right now, because actually, in reality, I think these two things are very much linked. As our listeners know, as you know, we have different biases right here. I'm actually worried that right now we're trying to just scapegoat Netanyahu as the problem, when it's a much deeper problem than that in terms of Israel's relationship to the Palestinians. We can talk about some of that another day. But right now, when we see sort of this distract and deflect from Iran, that's a dynamic that we've seen for many years, and it's important not to fall for it. And at the same time, we're looking at catastrophic realities on the ground. It's going to take decades for us to actually rebuild Gaza, for example, billions of dollars. We don't even know what a day after looks like at this point. Hamas has not been eradicated as we were promised. Hostages haven't been returned home. More of them are killed. There's no clear path forward. And yet still, if we look at a fair assessment of the reality, it seems that this catastrophe is on the verge of cataclysm if we go to regional war. So the fact of the matter is that Iran both is a distraction, but there is something there. Like, is there a chance that this could erupt into regional war or later? What is that chance, and how should we think about that?
So let's start with the Gaza war. I think you would find among national security experts globally a consensus that for Israel, the Gaza war has been a complete and catastrophic failure. The Israeli military and political leadership failed to detect that the attack was coming, so you have an intelligence failure. 6 months in, they have laid waste to Gaza, but they failed to accomplish their number one strategic objective, which is destroy Hamas. So that's a military failure. They have failed to win global support for Israel's cause. So a diplomatic failure, a support that they had almost universally after the October 6th attack. And like the United States after 9/11, they squandered that global support in this futile military attack. So you also have the complication of Netanyahu's political fortunes, which depend on him remaining in power so he could use, for example, stepping down from power as part of a plea bargain in the criminal trial that he's currently engaged in. And everyone knows that after this war is over, he's going to be forced to leave because he's hugely unpopular in Israel. Only about 15% of the population support him. So it's in his interest to keep the war going. So how does you do that? Well, one strategy for doing that is that you expand the conflict. You cover up or you detract from your failures by expanding it, and that may be what he's doing with Iran. I have to say, I would say the consensus of American national security analysts right now on what's going on with this Iran Israel tit for tat is we don't know. We can't predict. This could go in either direction. And one direction is sort of what it appears that both sides are doing. Both attacks, the attack on the Damascus Iranian consulate, then the Iranian response, and then the Israeli response with this, what appears now to be drone attacks on facilities in the Iranian city of Isfahan. These appear to be measured steps, not full-out assaults, not a Pearl Harbor type attack, but a measured attack that is more messaging and more signaling and trying to get the other side to back off rather than to accomplish a significant military advantage. And that may be the case. That may be, we may see the end of it now. Maybe these three reciprocal attacks will calm down and we'll see it. The problem is, for as long as there's been wars, there's been observers warning us that no strategy survives contact with the enemy. And if this is Israel's intention or if it's Iran's intention, there's a way these things can get out of hand. Some of the attacks could have consequences that you don't anticipate. So it is possible that that Israel won't be satisfied with this recent attack. And we can go into the details of the attack on Isfahan if you'd like. But already Netanyahu is facing criticism of his political coalition partners, particularly Ben Gvir, who mocked the attack as weak. And so if Netanyahu, whose image depends on him being seen as a strong man, as a savior for Israel, if he feels that he's being seen as weak, he may feel, okay, we have to do something else. We have to go again. Or Iran, with its own factions. We talk about Iran, but we should be talking about Irans, plural, because there's all these factions competing inside Iran. And there are people to the right of the supreme leader, particularly in the Revolutionary Guard, who want to hit Israel hard. And they have a lot of ballistic missiles that they could use that would penetrate or overwhelm any defenses that performed very well on the April 13th drone and cruise missile attacks, but could not withstand a really determined Iranian attack. So this thing could escalate. And if it escalates, this is a catastrophe that is President Biden's worst nightmare. Since the beginning, since October 7th attack, the number one American goal is to prevent this from becoming a regional conflagration because of the casualties that would involve, because of the disruption to the international system, because Iran could close down the Straits of Hormuz and cripple about 1/5 of the global oil supply, which would send global markets tumbling and cause economic recession during an election year, by the way. And that's just the beginning of the kinds of catastrophes you could see. So there is a real risk that this could escalate out of anybody's control, no matter what the intentions are in Tehran or in Jerusalem. This thing could spiral out of control, and that's why you keep hearing people making World War I references. Everybody thought they could design a move that would send a signal that would quickly achieve a military victory. But none of those intentions were realized. The conflicts spiraled out of control.
Listening to you, Joe, I'm even more terrified. We do want to land this in a slightly like realistic, hopeful place, but I just have to say, I mean, you said that our administration's number one goal was not to allow this to be a regional conflict. And notwithstanding the absolute horror that we're witnessing, which, the International Court of Justice is calling a plausible case of genocide on the ground in Gaza, human beings have not experienced anything like this, in mass and in generations. Notwithstanding that, the fact that the stated objective of our government is they've just completely failed at this. There's been stuff happening throughout the region consistently, and every day this persists. This is what a lot of people were saying. A lot of us were saying from day one, whatever your views are on how to respond to October 7th or not, there was no way that this was going to destroy Hamas. This was not the path to bring back hostages and other captives. This was not going to bring us closer to a two-state solution or any accommodation. It's just terrifying that if this is, the objective we've been working to, every day this persists, is bringing us closer to a real World War I scenario. But I wonder, I'd love your insight here. You may disagree with some of my analysis, but the Israeli sort of response to the Iranian attack here, it seemed really underwhelming in a way. And I wonder, given that Netanyahu clearly wants to blow this up, the way to deal with a big problem, make it bigger, right? I wonder, is some of this because of international pressure? Is some of this because President Biden and European Union and close allies are really starting to say, hey, wait a second, Israel, we want to support you guys, but you are making this really impossible right now. And no, we can't let this go farther. So I'm wondering for our listeners, has some of their advocacy helped in sort of contain this, or is that a step too far to say at this point?
I think it has helped. Seeing it help now makes us all feel, well, why didn't Biden do this sooner? Because this was his original plan. I have a newsletter on Substack called Strategy and History. And early on, I wrote about the Biden response to October 7th. And I was completely with him on the strategy. Stand with Israel, show support. They call this the big hug strategy, make sure that Israel knows it's not alone, that it doesn't have to get desperate, that it's got U.S. and global support for this, and then deliver quiet punches, a message of restraint. And if you listen to Biden's early speeches on this, that's what he was saying. In particular, don't make the mistake that we did after 9/11, right? We blamed Saddam Hussein for the 9/11 attack, completely wrong. Israel's blaming Iran for the Hamas attack, completely wrong. And then we decided to solve the problem by invading Iraq. And Biden was counseling restraint. Well, Netanyahu completely ignored that repeatedly, consistently, and Biden did nothing. He kept doing this quiet diplomacy. And part of that quiet diplomacy, including shipping billions of dollars worth of weapons to Israel, in a way, by the way, that as a former congressional staffer, I spent 10 years in the House, in a way that subverted congressional oversight. Every tranche of weapons that he sent to Israel was below the threshold, the monetary threshold required, that would require congressional approval. So he ships all this, including the 2,000-pound bombs, the 1,000-pound bombs. Finally, world pressure builds on Biden, and Biden starts to shift gears. And you've seen in the last month the Israeli strategy change. We're not seeing the bombardments that we saw. We're seeing an increase, still insufficient, in humanitarian aid, and all that starts to happen. We're seeing Biden stay the hand of Netanyahu, who wants to invade Rafah, the last remaining semi-safe space in Gaza. And what happens? Bang. Netanyahu shifts over to Iran, expands, as you say, is trying to solve a bigger problem by making it bigger, and that some of the pressure's off. Can the pressure be brought back on? Biden, I think, is sending a very clear message: do not retaliate against Iran. And I think Netanyahu is listening. And that may be why the strike on Isfahan was so modest. Can we just talk about that strike just for a little bit, about what we know right now? Okay. So there are various ways Israel can strike Iran, but for several years now, it's been using these drone attacks. And that appears to be what happened at Isfahan. At first, we thought it was a ballistic missile. In fact, some Pentagon officials say it was a missile from Israel. But the indications, as we record this, are that it was a quadcopter attack. These drones that have four little helicopter-like rotors on them that were probably launched from inside Iran. So this was a covert operations. This has happened before. Israel has done this before, including last year or maybe 18 months ago in Isfahan itself. Now, when I heard that there was an attack on Isfahan, as David said, I was coming back from the airport at midnight the other night, I thought, Isfahan, oh no, don't tell me they're following John Bolton's advice and they're going after the nuclear site. Because in Isfahan is a uranium conversion facility. I have been to that facility. I've been to Isfahan. I'm one of the few Westerners besides IAEA inspectors who have been in there, and I've seen it. This is a key component of the Iranian nuclear program, and it's a relatively soft target. It's above ground. It's not like the centrifuge facilities, which are deep underground. This one you could knock out, and you might be able to knock it out with drones, right? And I thought, oh, don't tell me they're doing this. And you have hawks in the U.S. and in Israel who are arguing now's the time to take out Iran's nuclear program, something they've wanted to do for decades. Let's go do it. And I thought, are they doing that? But no, it doesn't appear that they're going big on their retaliation. This appears to be a messaging. And I think they chose Isfahan, of all the possible targets, to sort of let Iran know we could do more, We could do more. Don't retaliate against us after this attack. Let's everybody stand down, which is the message that Iran sent after its April 13th attack on Israel. We're done now. Let's settle down. The pressure on Netanyahu, I think, was too great to not respond in some way. I believe that what both sides want right now is to calm things down and not have this escalate. I just don't know if we can get there, if this will work.
But the interesting thing, though, we've been talking about this whiplash. Like last night, I saw this around midnight too, and was like, oh my God.
Right. I hit the panic button just like you.
Right. And this was also happening. I'm also a professor at Columbia, like after Columbia president's disastrous testimony in front of Congress the day before and arresting 100 students. That's a whole nother conversation. But the reason why I'm raising this is like we always talk about this Iranian dark horse, Iranian distraction. And you've been really focused on that and sort of the messaging there. But people's attention now is back to Gaza. It's back to Gaza where in a way it should be. And I want to come back to that because our policy since October 7th, I disagree with your assessment personally. I think that President Biden made some real missteps there. I come from this not just as, somebody who's Palestinian and runs Telos, but I worked on the negotiations around Gaza's disengagement in 2005. I spent 3 years of my life actually talking about Gaza 2020 and what Gaza would look like if it was sealed off from the world, as Israel did, in violation of the agreements around its pullout from Gaza. And there's a whole UN report you can look at where the entire world, including Israeli Shin Bet and everyone, predicted exactly what we saw happen in October in Israel. Well, not exactly, but pretty much this scenario for 2020, not for 2023, and said that there was a different possibility for Gaza, a different possibility if Gazans were allowed to actually breathe. And now we're looking at this historic break right now. And our administration right now knew exactly what was up. I'm sorry to go on a rant, but I met with Secretary of State Tony Blinken a couple months ago, and his defense was like, "Oh no, we're talking to Bibi. I spent hours getting him to open up the border for humanitarian aid with Rafah," and completely ignore the fact that they'd sidestepped and continue to sidestep Congress until today to fast track weapons, massive dumb bombs, smart bombs that are destroying entire families' lives, livelihoods, generations in one of the oldest continuously inhabited places on Earth. And so why I'm coming back to this point is we're going to disagree on a lot of our analysis or whatever our situationality. But I think where we're landing right now is that this is a really critical moment, not just for the people of Gaza, but for all Palestinians, for all Israelis, for the region right now. And whether our government has stewarded our power well, that's, and when it stopped stewarding it well is up to debate, but we do have some potential influence. And now is the time more than ever, if you've never spoken up, whatever your affiliation is, to do that. We need a ceasefire. We don't know what comes next, but we need this to stop before this goes any further. It actually can get worse, but we have power to make sure it doesn't.
Oh, yeah. Well, we agree on that. And I think we also agree on this. The way to prevent a war isn't to start a war. And that's what I'm afraid Israel, or at least the current government of Israel, is doing. But there are some off ramps we can take here. And some of those off ramps are being made possible because, as Nick Kristof puts out in his column just out today, Friday, that the Gaza war has become an albatross around Joe Biden's neck. This is really creating a political problem for him. And it might cost him votes in key states like Wisconsin and Michigan. It's becoming an international problem for him. All our allies want this war to stop, and all our allies want the administration to do more. So can you do more? Well, there are inklings of possibility on two fronts. One, there are reports out just in the last couple of days that the U.S. wants to go big on diplomacy, and I think that's something we should be supporting. One of the reasons they weren't pressuring Israel on Palestine before October 6th is that they thought they could create this mega deal, that they could get Saudi Arabia to recognize Israel. They could bring together a coalition, and in that larger coalition, Israel could prosper. And in that prosperity, you could then turn to the Palestinian problem. I think that was wrong. I think that was an analysis that was fundamentally flawed on multiple levels, but that's what they thought, and that's what they were going for. Well, in some ways, they're coming back to this. There are reports that the Biden administration is trying to press Netanyahu to get a ceasefire to end the war in Gaza, and in return, we would go back to this Saudi gambit, where Saudi Arabia would recognize Israel and we'd have diplomatic recognition. We go to that. And coupled with that, there are indications that the Biden administration belatedly wants to turn again to diplomacy with Iran to try to find avenues with Iran. Remember, the only thing that's worked to restrain Iran, to moderate Iranian behavior, and to moderate its nuclear program has been diplomacy. I was deeply involved in a campaign of non-government organizations during the Obama administration to encourage and then to help craft and then to protect the Iran nuclear deal that did what no bombs, no threats, no assassinations could do. We shrank Iran's program to a fraction of its size, put it in a box for 25 years with cameras and inspectors on it so that we basically solved the Iranian nuclear threat. And that was working until Donald Trump pulled out of it in 2018 and tried this policy of maximum pressure. We were going to pressure Iran to give up the program and get a bigger, better deal. Well, that failed miserably, but the same people who are promoting that are once again out there talking for military strikes on Iran. I'm talking about John Bolton, Senator Tom Cotton, almost anybody that appears on Fox News. This is their solution. So that is to say, they think there's a military solution to these problems. I think with you, Greg, that the only way to solve any of these, the Iran problem, the Palestinian problem, is by concerted diplomacy. If the administration is inclined to try that again, we should be out there encouraging that. And one of the ways we could encourage that is when Congress passes an Israeli assistance package, and it looks like that might happen before this podcast airs. The vote seems to be scheduled for Saturday. So we're going to give Israel, I think the figure is $14 billion in aid. We should be pressuring our representatives to make sure that the aid that we give Israel is defensive in nature and not offensive. Like, for example, yes, air defenses, yes, Patriot missiles, yes, support for Iron Dome, but no 2,000-pound bombs, no 1,000-pound bombs, nothing that would help it prosecute its war in Gaza or strikes on Iran. We can limit the military assistance we give Israel and then have some real levers to try to affect Israeli behavior.
I mean, one of the conversations that was happening prior to the original Israeli strike in the Damascus consulate is on these other kinds of conditions around Israeli aid too, of recognizing or requiring review of the way in which these weapons, these munitions are used in ways that don't violate basic human rights. I think what you're telling us is that we even need to think more creatively around what kinds of weapons at all are even being sent. I think it's an important thing to consider.
And members of Congress are thinking like this. For example, so Gregory Meeks, that's the ranking Democrat on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, he's sitting on he has to sign off on any aid to Israel. Right now, he's sitting on an aid that's already been approved but hasn't been delivered to Israel because he has concerns about its offensive capabilities. He has concerns about how this might be used in Gaza. So we already see people doing that. My senator from Maryland, Chris Van Hollen, has been a leading voice on this. And he's one of a dozen senators who have been saying, no, we have to start conditioning aid to Israel. I got to tell you, I've been in Washington for 40 years. Conditioning aid to Israel has been a third rail in American politics. You just do not do that. You don't talk like that. Well, we're talking like that now. In my view, Israel has lost Washington. We are seeing, because of what they've been doing in Gaza, a fundamental shift in the way particularly Democrats, but all increasingly security analysis across the board, look at Israel, talk about Israel, whether they trust Israel, whether they defer to Israel, and willing to do things with Israel that we routinely do with other countries, but we've always had this Israeli exception in our law. Well, that exception is closing. It's not done now, but I think it's moving in that direction. I think that's part of the reason Netanyahu is trying to change the conversation. I think Iran understands this. and is acting with some restraint on this matter and trying to bring the conversation back to Gaza.
I think that's also why it's so important for our folks, our listeners, to re-engage in this moment, right? Because that tide was shifting. There was this exception that was being challenged. The discourse was changing, and we've been talking about this since October, but where there's no going back. We're in an entirely different world today than we were prior to October. And some of these conditions, some of these, shifts in the way that we aid and support Israel are necessary. And in this moment, there's this risk from this escalation, from us turning our eyes to Iran and the threat that it poses to challenge this. So it's an important moment for our listeners, for folks who care about human rights, basic human rights in the region, to continue to put pressure so that we don't lose focus in this moment from what's really important. We have to stay focused.
There's imminent famine in Gaza for hundreds and thousands of people right now. So yeah, maybe a few more trucks are getting in, but people, and particularly children, are dying of malnutrition. This is insanity. We can't take our eyes off the ball. 2, we're talking about regional escalation. Nobody is talking about Jerusalem, and so many of our listeners have connections to faith communities here. Like, imagine there are, this is not representative of Israelis, certainly not representative of Jewish people anywhere, but there are extremists currently in power who've long wanted to destroy Al-Aqsa Mosque, who've long wanted to get rid of Palestinians. They see this as an opportunity. The longer this goes on, there's risk of regional war, and there's risk of something catastrophic right there on the ground. We have to restrain people in. And finally, I think, Joe, part of what you're awakening us to, whatever our perspective is, however we come at this, like, there are other ways. It wasn't like, well, what do you do about Hamas after October 7th? And that's particularly true for the people on this call. The part of Biden's decision-making is part of Trump's decision-making. Remember President Trump, when he moved the embassy to Jerusalem, he said, I did that for the evangelicals. President Biden presumed right after October 7th, I'm going to get the progressives. We need to work for the persuadables. They're non-denominational Christians. Many of the people on this podcast, right? Like the swing voters in swing states. When we show up and make our voices heard right now, that we are for fundamental human rights, that we want safety, dignity, equality for everyone, Israeli and Palestinian, whether 2-state, 1-state solution, before all of those things, even that, like, when we're showing up, people from unusual backgrounds saying, hey, enough, there's a different way forward. Our futures are intertwined. Everyone has a right to these basic human rights. We're going to fight for them, and we want our politicians to represent us. That changes the political dynamic today, not years from now. And so our government yesterday vetoed Palestinian statehood at the Security Council again. That was a mistake. They're going to change that. They're not going to veto it in the future if more of us speak up now. So our time really is now. We don't have to agree on all of the big politics and all of those things, but if we can agree that there's no good future for anyone in Israel, Palestine, without a good reality for everyone, we've got our charge. There's a lot we can do today. We've got to make our voices heard now.
Yeah, well, I agree with you, Greg. And I think we also agree that the only real solution to this is a 2-state solution. It's not easy. It's never been easy, but it's the only one that provides that kind of dignity and security guarantees for both Palestinians and Israelis. And I'm encouraged by this. One, by the shift I've seen with a 2-state solution, which has long been off the table, is bang, straight on. This is the U.S. policy objective now, to achieve the 2-state solution. I don't think Biden would have talked that way at the beginning of this year, the beginning of last year, but he's talking about it now. The other thing that encourages me is the shift in American politics. It's clear from everything we know in polls as well. America doesn't want to go to war with Iran. American public doesn't want to go to war with Iran. It doesn't want Israel to go to war with Iran. And it now is because of what's happened in Gaza, the American public has a much more skeptical view of Israel. And I see that as particularly in the generational shift that has occurred. These demonstrations that are occurring around the country, probably the most dynamic section of the progressive movement right now, is a movement that's asking for for respect and security for Palestinians, to stop this war. Even while these tit-for-tat strikes were going on, massive demonstrations were happening, closing down traffic. Reminiscent of my anti-Vietnam War days, when I would be participating in this, shutting down traffic, trying to disrupt traffic, saying no business as usual while we're bombing Vietnam. Now it's no business as usual while we're starving Palestinians. And that is a very encouraging sign to me. And finally, I'm going to say this as sort of a warning for Israel, and maybe an encouragement for your listeners. As I say, my family's Jewish, but my kids, they don't look to Israel as part of their Jewish identity. Both my son and my daughter made birthright trips, which were designed by American Jewish community to bond the American Jewish community to Israel. And we have family in Israel, but they don't think about Israel. This Passover, when we celebrate, we're not going to be focusing on Israel. We're going to be focusing on our Jewish identity, but that does not include saying that we're wedded to Israel, and particularly not to this government of Israel. And I see that generational shift happening. I know that's a longer term trend, but it feeds into the shorter term political imperatives that we have now. The basis is there for change now in U.S. approach towards Israel and towards Palestine, and it's only going to get stronger as the years go on, as the rising generations come into positions of power.
Joe, I have to add one thing, and you can speak back to it too, but as we're closing up, just about the two-state solution, maybe we'll have another conversation around that. Like, we're not anti-two-state solution. I worked decades of my life for a two-state solution. I think just as the generational conversation is shifting, there's some real concerns about that. And the last thing I want to do is demonize anyone who is advocating for, and you didn't do this at all, but who's advocating for fundamental dignity, security for Israelis and for Palestinians alike. I think those values are important. And given the realities on the ground, there is really interesting conversation in a number of sectors about, well, if a two-state solution is no longer possible, what comes next to protect those core values for everyone? There's confederation models out there. There's one and there are a variety of different models that are being discussed. But I think what is important, given the realities on the ground, what we really care about, what Israelis and Palestinians want, Jewish, Muslim, and Christian, is to be safe in their communities, safe in their identities. And as absurd as it might feel, because it's been a two-state solution talk all this time, this may no longer be possible. And I'm in this for my family, for the future of the world, regardless of the political accommodation, just as there can be, a disastrous one-state, so there's 1,000 one-state solutions. The same is true for a two-state solution. Netanyahu, until a few months ago, supported a two-state solution, and only rhetorically, as do members of Congress now. And what's really important are the values that animate that. And so I want to come back to that. But the thing I think that really, for me personally, there isn't a lot of hope in this moment. I think there's nothing that redeems what Palestinians are going through in Gaza right now. It's irredeemable. What Israeli families went to, which was wrong on October 7th and must, in my personal view, be condemned. Violence against civilians is always wrong. That's the basis of the world order where right makes might that we should all be working to build, right? But I think the thing is there are these multi-generational shifts, and when we were growing up and we were like cutting our teeth, it was a very different conversation. And these younger generations, whether they're Jewish, they're Palestinian, they're evangelical that we work with around the country, hey, these values matter. We want representative government. We don't believe that my power has to mean restricting someone else's power. And in fact, that actually might ultimately make us less safe. So there is new conversation, new imagination, new work, new relationships happening. And I think we need to recognize that, own that, and follow the lead of some of these younger generations who are inheriting a huge mess from us.
Amen. I have nothing to add to that, Greg. You said it very well. Thank you very much. And thank you for all the work that you do. When I was on a Telos trip, it really just sort of not just changed my understanding of the Palestinian-Israeli dynamic, but it changed my life. I mean, that visit, you and I walked in the streets of Hebron. I had no idea that that's what it was like. until I took that trip with you. So thank you and David for all the work that you're doing. We need you out there, man. We need you doing what you're doing and preaching what you're preaching.
Thank you, Joe. It's so kind, and it's certainly encouraging for us in the midst of what Greg described as a very difficult season. The news that we're seeing, the images and stories that we're seeing coming from Gaza right now and from Israel on October 7th, they are really horrific. For many of us, they're sticking with us for a long time, and we're grieving, all of us in our world even. And yet, I think what you reminded us of is so important, not only to stay focused in the urgent, but also to be able to expand our view to the long term too. I thought of a quote from Dr. King as you were talking about that. The moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice because we bend it. As our friend Dr. Ainka Jackson says, we are the arc benders. We have to get to work, and however long it takes, it responds to our actions. So we have to be the ones who get out in the streets, who call our representatives, who talk to our elected leaders, who engage in conversation, who keep this front and center to help bend that moral arc towards justice, right? That's our job in this moment, folks. So stay tuned in, lean in, speak up, don't let up. This is an urgent moment, and we have to stay focused. And together, our actions, as we spoke about, can and are making a difference. Thanks for listening, folks.